I feared the lack of financial stability, and I maybe feared the lack of not meeting certain social expectations around an ideal of success. And the idea of like, if you had got an offer from KPMG, like, why wouldn't you take it? I remember very distinctly, even before I joined, thinking I don't agree with certain values and principles that they hold, but I sort of did it on autopilot. There's one moment that always sticks out is like we were in a Christmas party and there was a group of like partners huddled around a phone. It'd just been announced that the Tories had won the election and there was like a massive cheer. And I just remember like sat with my mate and just thinking, what am I doing here?
Today's guest is Abbas Shapuri. Abbas is now a member of the worker co-op third sector accountancy, but before joining the co-op world, he spent years working at a corporate KPMG, a job that often clashed with his values and principles. Yet, like many, he felt stuck, unsure how to leave such a sought-after position and the financial security that comes with that. This is a story many can relate to, feeling trapped in a job that doesn't align with your beliefs, but staying out of fear of the unknown and lack of alternatives. Abbas, however, found a way out. In this episode, he shares his journey from the corporate world to the co-op one, reflecting on the challenges he encountered along the way. Abbas, welcome to Punchcard.
Thank you, Caleb. Nice to see you.
For the listeners who might be new to cooperatives, can you explain in your own words what a worker co-op is?
Yeah, definitely, Caleb. I think for me, what I think a worker cooperative is the employees taking ownership of management and control of organizations, being both the boss and employee at the same time. And yeah, the idea that actually the people doing the work on the day-to-day deserve a sense of autonomy to be able to make the decisions that direct the work that they do, who they work with. And I think from a personal perspective, I've seen the difference it makes to me, but also just from a theory perspective, having autonomy and having independence in a place where you're at for the majority of your life, right? Like, you know, we spend more time at work than we probably will do with any other group of people or any other environment. And having autonomy and say in how that operates and how that runs, I think is fundamental to a democratic society in many ways, because, yeah, if you don't have democracy in the workplace, how can you really believe you can change anything outside of the workplace?
Before we talk about the worker co-op that you're a part of, I'd like to first take a little bit of a step back and explore some of the formative experiences and maybe what politicized you or led you towards worker co-ops.
Yeah, definitely, Caleb. Thank you. I sort of grew up in a place called Sparkbrook in Birmingham, so it was quite socioeconomically sort of a difficult area in terms of unemployment was quite high, level of crime, etc. But I guess fundamentally before that, my dad moved over from Uganda in the 70s, I believe, when a Ugandan dictator called Idi Amin, he sort of expelled all Asians and he said, you've got 90 days to leave. And then he moved over as an asylum seeker to the United Kingdom, was part of a refugee camp in the United Kingdom, married my mum who came over from India. Hearing the story of that struggle and being a first generation immigrant definitely has played a massive impact. Like there was a strong sense of community, a massive sense of community. And I think that's something that has shaped my life massively and probably has been one of the biggest realizations of like this idea of community and of building something as a group is beautiful. And it is the way. We've still got like a centre in Birmingham and, you know, I still go regularly. But this sort of community, it wasn't overtly political, I don't think. I guess there was a politicisation or an understanding of organisation because, like, you know, we'd get invited to AGMs and we'd vote on certain things as a community about, you know, where we want our money to go, what we're spending, do we buy a new dishwasher or things like that.
What were the communities that were there that were asking for these, you know, having AGMs? Like, what were they based around? Were they based around religion or just around the geographical area?
I think it was a lot more than that in the sense that this was a group of people who had fled Uganda together. It was essentially family ties in many ways, right? They'd spent time in a refugee camp together and then they'd been dispersed across the UK. So there's people in Leicester, in Birmingham, in London, in Peterborough. And the community was a way for people to sort of collectivize, like, you know, people put in their own money initially to buy the certain centres where people would gather for like religious and community events and things. So I think that community had a massive impact on me growing up. even though I was less involved then than I am now.
You know, everything you just said there, like, is extremely co-op adjacent, you know, like the way of like pooling money to buy resources, coming together and being a collective that has a kind of shared goal and looking out for each other.
And I guess also just community of friends. Like, there's still people that I'm really close to today. Whilst I had this community, which was, you know, a bit more well-to-do, my sort of material reality was that I was going to school. It was completely working class. And the things we'd talk about things that were unfair to us. And even just simple things of like the way we dealt with money, like, you know, we all didn't have that much money to spend. So when we'd go out, sometimes people had a bit more money than others and you just buy something for everyone. And there was that idea of like, yeah, we're all sort of in this together. We were definitely one of the poorer families within this sort of wider Indian, Ugandan diaspora. That had material impacts, right? Like during the conversations you'd have of like, where are you going on holiday? We might not go on holiday that much. What are you doing at the weekend? Those kind of questions, in many ways, they were already present in the mind of like, you know, why is my life like this and their life like this? I think the other thing around class politics that may have been really interesting is rap music. Akala was rapping about like the Haitian Revolution. It wasn't mainstream rap, but actually in the schools that we were going to, these were people and almost elders that were respected. And that seeking of knowledge and seeking knowledge being a sexy thing rather than like, oh, being a geek, that I think had a massive impact on my sort of politicization.
And yeah, Loki and Akala both, it's very much about sort of anti-imperialism, neo-colonialism, all those kinds of things. I'd say maybe the left-wing kind of Marxist element isn't quite as strong.
Yeah, definitely can. So I think in terms of class politics, you're absolutely right that they probably didn't focus on that as much. But I think what they did is they provided a gateway. I remember once seeing like a reading list that Akala had published, and it had tons of books about class politics. And then you start a journey into reading things. And I think it was maybe a catalyst rather than a direct impact. It's like a positive virus in the sense of like, once you start to want to learn more about it, for me, it became a bit of a, okay, yeah, I'll read like 1984. I'll read Brave New World. But then I was like, okay, what is the commentary around 1984? And then you read a bit of Marx and then you read a bit of Bakunin. I think the other thing around class politics that may have been really interesting is that I was always fairly academic, but academic in the sense of I just wanted to just get good grades for my mum and dad to feel proud rather than, in many ways, it was quite a hollow academic in the sense that I if you'd asked me, like, I probably didn't care at all about what I was like learning to do tests for. It was purely about the end result of getting a grade, and actually to read for joy came a bit later on. And then sort of college, university was more when I started to read a bit more into things. And
what do you think motivated that desire to prove yourself to your parents and to do right by them through grades? Like, do you have an idea of what kind of motivated that?
I think ultimately, yeah, is it an ego thing and a social status thing where, like, I remember, you know, you go to gatherings and the first thing they ask you is, what are you doing in school? How are your grades? Not even, hello, Abbas, how's life or anything. It's just like, what grades are you getting? Forget about, you know, asking questions about ethics and, you know, what do you enjoy or what you're passionate about. If you got grades, you were successful. And then by definition, the opposite of that is if you didn't get good grades, then you were deemed less worthy or less successful. As a kid, I was obsessed by these ideas because they were all around me. And I think the class thing did play a part. In my head, I was like, okay, if I can get the good grades, I can then buy certain things or do certain things. I can earn a lot of money. And that was just almost a natural conclusion that you get to. You know, you get a good job, you get good money, and then you'll be happy. That sort of layer of thoughts is never questioned. Now I look back, that I think I should have questioned is, does getting a good job and quote unquote good job and good money actually make you happy? And probably the answer's, after a base level of, you know, getting your needs met, probably not.
So you went to university, you were doing maths, you were kind of like, you know, the typical uni thing. Were you meeting a lot of people who shared these views, exploring that in more depth? Like, tell me how university kind of changed your view on the world.
University for me was like a bit of an odd time because, like, the first year of university, like, my dad passed away and I was still living at home. But in terms of politically, I didn't actually explore much, like, from a practical point of view. You know, I didn't join like an environmental or like a political society. I was still very much of the mind of like, okay, let's continue with the path of like getting good grades and then looking for a graduate job. Prior to sort of dad passing away, like there was four of us in the house. A few siblings had already moved out, but then my sister was going to move out because she was due to get married, and then dad passed away, delayed the wedding. But then within the space of like a year, the house went from sort of four people to just me and my mum. And so I guess there was definitely a feeling of like, okay, now I need to sort of step up in some ways. Like mum was on benefits. Yeah, so it felt like ripe for me to need to almost step into a bit of a role of almost getting the house in order in some ways.
How would you describe your other family members' kind of politics? Does it resonate with what you were learning and where you are now, or?
I don't think so, to be honest, Caleb. No, I don't think so. It's not that they would disagree. It's just that they take less interest in those aspects of political life and stuff.
Yeah, they're apathetic, maybe, would you say?
I think that's the right word, yeah.
And then, yeah, so after university, you kind of continue this journey that you're on to achieve, I guess, financial stability, a bit of comfort, maybe elevate your class. So you ended up going to KPMG, is that correct?
Yeah.
Tell me about that experience. How did working there clash or mix with some of the things that you believed and read about?
I remember very distinctly, even before I joined, thinking I don't agree with certain values and principles that they hold, but I sort of did it on autopilot. Do I look back and think it was the wrong decision? It's difficult to say because there was a lot of learning there and there were good people there as well. But I guess the culture there is, for the first 3 years, I was sort of working 50, 60 hours a week, on top of that doing exam revision. And so in many ways, there wasn't much time to think of anything else but just getting through the exams and getting to the end of it. I'll never forget, like, there's one moment that always sticks out is like we were in a Christmas party and there was a group of like partners huddled around a phone. It'd just been announced that the Tories had won the election and there was like a massive cheer. And I just remember like sat with my mate and just thinking, what am I doing here? What's going on? And I think as time went on, it felt more and more necessary for me to want to move and get out of that space.
I know we've kind of touched on it quite a lot already, maybe quite in some ways a bit briefly. Before it was about achieving grades, and now we've got this transition to you going to somewhere which does quite visibly jar with your values. Like, how did you justify that to yourself?
You know, it's interesting. I remember reading something, I think it was like in a Khalid Hosseini book, is it the Thousand Splendid Suns, that said, our actions are more likely to be driven by what we fear rather than what we would like to do. And that's always sort of stuck in my head because in many ways it was true that, like, because of upbringing and I guess because I feared the lack of financial stability and I maybe feared the lack of not meeting certain social expectations around an ideal of success. And the idea of like, if you had got an offer from KPMG, like, why wouldn't you take it? Like, it's almost absurd. Like, I don't think I had the self-confidence in me and maybe hadn't seen some of the alternatives, right? And I guess that's probably one thing where, you know, I didn't come from a background where people were involved in politics at all. Whilst there was class consciousness, I couldn't see a viable alternative with my eyes. So like, whilst I was reading about alternatives, I didn't see one visibly that I was like, oh yeah, look at these guys, they're doing something different. I wasn't brought up in that sort of environment. And so that fear was probably more like fear of the unknown, fear of disappointing people, fear of, you know, am I letting go of a good opportunity?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about not having, I guess we could call the role models or examples to look up to. You've just got all these kind of theoretical ideas. And I think where I was exposed to people who I started to consider to be my role models was at university. And it sounds like your experience of university was a little bit different in the sense that, well, one, you were living at home, and two, you were very focused on grades. I'd kind of given up on grades by that point.
Yeah.
So you enter KPMG holding this fear and kind of wanting to create some stabilities for yourself, maybe a reputation, to be seen as successful, or a mixture of these things. How did you evolve over time to be let go of those fears to then be able to explore other options?
I think it was role models. I think it definitely felt like that was the big push. And when I was in secondary school, I used to be part of like a theatre company. They let a group of 12 or 13, 15, 16-year-olds like run a theatre company. So we had these amazing mentors, one of the arts directors at this charity, the Gap Arts Project. It was amazing because like it was basically a co-op in everything but name. She was like, you guys are like the people who are doing the performing. Here's a budget, plan what you need to do, plan what you rehearse. It was incredible. And I'd sort of rekindled a connection with her again. And like I'd joined the board as a trustee. That gave me access to like real life examples of people who'd been doing activism of different senses in all different areas in front of my eyes, and like for decades. It was stunning to see. And I think the bigger couple of things was that a close friend of mine, someone who was at TSA, he joined a housing co-op, a Radical Roots housing co-op. For people who don't know what Radical Roots is, it's sort of like a secondary co-op where they sort of try and help people fund to build new housing co-ops, but also it's fundamentally a community of people who are trying to make changes and make housing more secure for everyone. So there's a site, Diggers and Dreamers. It's a directory of like all housing cooperatives and various communal housing setups. And I remember seeing it ages ago and thinking, bloody hell, this is incredible. But again, sort of similar to sort of past history, I'll see and then not do anything. And then this very close friend of mine, I remember sending him it. And like within 2 months, he was like, Abbas, I'm going to go see one. And I was like, bloody hell, that's quick. And like within 2 months, he was already part of like a joining process for a really incredible housing co-op in Derbyshire. And so I think it was building connections with those people and then going to like a Radical Roots gathering where I think the blinkers sort of opened completely. A Radical Roots gathering is like a gathering every quarter, completely volunteer run. 100, 200 people turn up. There's training sessions. It was like radical. It was actually radical. And it was like, how are these people completely volunteer led, creating this community out of nothing and creating secure housing? Some of the people you meet there are fascinating. People who had traveled to America to like look at the American co-op scene, and just chatting to some of these people, I was like, okay, there is an alternative. There is a different way of doing this.
So this friend of yours, first he got involved in this housing co-op, then it was after that he got involved in third sector accounting?
I think Alex had said to me, I've heard about somebody who works at this place, third sector. They're right up your street. I remember looking at like the values of TSA and thinking, I need to join. Like it's a no-brainer. And I applied and then I rejected them for some reason. And I think that's that fear thing. And I joined like a company called IHG, which is sort of like a hotel company. And then whilst I was with IHG, I think I applied again, and then halfway through, and then I rejected them again, which is absurd. And then I remember speaking to Akil and thinking, bloody hell, these guys are never going to respond to me ever again. And then Akil had joined because he got back into accountancy. And so he joined TSA. And yeah, that was the sort of the path in.
This journey that you went on from hearing about TSA, applying 3 times, it's not that they didn't want you, it's that you rejected them. Just tell me, what were you feeling at the time? Like when you were writing these emails to like, sorry, I actually don't want this job. The first and the second time, what was it that you were feeling? Were you feeling it wasn't the right time? Or was it like a step down that you weren't ready for?
Yeah, it was an absolute mess. And I think it was, again, that sort of driven by fear thing. I think fundamentally it was because of the nature of TSA and who we work with. And I guess also who we want to be, right? Like our pay ratio is like 2.5 to 1. And that is an absurd pay ratio in the context of other accountancy firms. And when you're defining things and success by numbers, I had a job offer from IHG as well, which was about 60% higher in pay. It was also more secure or stable because it was a bigger company. And so then you think, okay, why would I not go for them? And then the second time was a lot worse because then I was a year into IHG. And I did love IHG because of the people. But as I was going in to do more Radical Root stuff and more co-op stuff, it felt more and more certain that I was going to make the jump. And then I remember emailing after a year saying, guys, I'm ready. Please take me. And we had another conversation. And imagine the pain for TSA because they had to then discuss this in a co-op meeting. And the second time, I spent like 2 or 3 weeks sort of debating it. And then I sort of sent a message. And then I literally didn't look at my emails for a bit because I was that terrified about the response. And funnily enough, they didn't ever respond, which was totally fair. So the third time I handed my notice in before I emailed them, because I guess it had gotten to the point where I said, okay, if I'm serious about this and I'd like to do something different with my career, then it can't be related to TSA, right? So like I had to be willing to accept, rightfully so, that the TSA might not just reply to me because they might just be completely done with me. But I wanted to hand my notice in first because the idea was that even if TSA don't get back to me, I still want to move to an organization or do some work that was a bit more value led. And it was really interesting because as soon as I handed my notice in, it was fine. Like, and in many ways, that's the funny thing about fear, isn't it? Is that it never usually is as bad as what the fear seems to be. And I remember sort of handing the notice in and feeling really free and feeling like I'll email TSA, but if they don't get back to me, I'm still committed to trying to do something a bit different.
So obviously Keel was very supportive of this idea, and you spoke to him about it. Were there other people you were speaking to about it, and what were their kind of thoughts about it?
Yeah, there was. Akil was massively supportive. It's been beautiful to have a friend to go through some of these conversations with, and so I felt very lucky about that. But I think even like family were really supportive. So like I know I said that like politically we're not as aligned as maybe the ideal would be, but like speaking to family, they were like, you know what, you should just go for it. Like it's totally fine. Because I guess for them, they'd seen that like I was almost over volunteering outside of my day job, almost to subsidize guilt. And so they were like, everything you're doing outside of work is very different to what you're doing in work. And so like, why don't you just simplify your life a bit and you'll feel a bit better? Yeah, I was really lucky to be supported.
And then looking around at kind of your contemporaries, like friends, people you went to uni with, and now that I met you, we've spoken a few times, I like to think that everybody is secretly an Abbas now. You know, everybody in KPMG who's like an underling secretly is like a left winger. How true do you think that, like, were a lot of your contemporaries kind of also felt that clash of values between what they were doing and what they believed, or?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Ken. I guess I can say that the friends that I had at KPMG and at like other places, it felt like there was more left-wing sentiment. And there was definitely times where I'd had discussions about certain things like this with people, and they'd be like, yeah, I agree, but like at the same time, what if I want to get married? What if I want to have kids? And it felt like there were similar things that were stopping them from doing something else. But I also think it's definitely the minority. There was definitely a majority of people who actually wanted to climb up the ladder at KPMG because it was financially amazing, right? The idea of looking at the workplace from a perspective of ethics isn't sort of encouraged as much. You could have like people with left-wing ideas, but then people associating that with the place they work. I didn't see it as something super prevalent, but there were definitely people who were interested in these things.
To me, it seems quite unique in the way that you were able to find an outlet through TSA. I imagine other people might find their way into like charities and stuff, but would you say that one of the largest barriers for this sort of thing happening is like the access, like the amount of those kinds of jobs? Or do you have a thought of kind of, what the barriers are for those people who are kind of left-leaning in these jobs? You know, that they've done a few years now, they've got that experience. Is there a kind of a lack of access there?
There's like a ton of people that I know, amazing individuals who have left-leaning ideas or just ideas about social justice, etc., that they'd love to put into practice. But there is a lack of sort of awareness that there is opportunities to do it. When I was talking about worker cooperatives, most people I spoke to in my circles had no idea what a worker co-op was. The idea of like a junior having the same vote as a partner in an organizational aspect was absurd. Like they were like, what? Like surely that's going to be chaotic. And it was the linking of there is an alternative with certain existing politics that people already have. I think that's the biggest problem, and like lack of role models and stuff.
Now, it perfectly segues into me being able to talk about how great Punchcard is and why everybody should listen and support it. So if you are enjoying listening to Punchcard so far and would like for us to be able to keep making these episodes, then please do consider making a monthly contribution. You can find our funding page at opencollective.com/workers/co-op/projects/punchcard, or the link is in the show notes. So yeah, if you want people to be bumped along the river towards worker co-ops by this podcast, then please help us continue to make these.
Yeah, big Punchcard.
Big up Punchcard. We'll transition now to actually being in a worker co-op. It's kind of in the name, but tell me what third sector accountancy does, when it started, and kind of how many members it is.
So we do, I guess, similar things to most company accountancy firms. So we do like tax, VAT, audit, accounts prep, bookkeeping, etc. But it was sort of started and set up about 7 or 8 years ago by a group of 5 or 6 friends with a desire to create an accountancy firm which is not privately owned but is cooperatively owned. And we only work with organizations who are in the sort of co-op and not-for-profit sector. That could be charities, cooperatives, but also like CICs, right? So essentially we just want to work with organizations that are doing good. That's sort of third sector in a nutshell.
Great. And then what was it like to join? So you've come from your big corporate life, you're not feeling like your values are aligning with what you're doing. You're in this very hierarchical place. How did then go into third sector accountancy operate differently?
It was like massively different. I remember the first day joining, the first thing that hit me was just the level of transparency at a worker co-op. Like the moment you're a worker member, you have access. Like I remember seeing a payroll file that had a list of what everyone was being paid and like board minutes about certain organizational discussion. And it just blew my mind that this is just the way it is. And the practices around sociocracy. So the idea that everyone takes part in not only the accountancy part of the job, but you get to take part in organizational running. I think that was just a massive shift, because at a different company, the idea that a junior can join and within 6 months, they're talking about strategy, they're talking about changes that they want to see implemented from day one. And that is so exciting. Like, really fundamental things like what should the pay ratio be? How much should we spend on pro bono time? Or what we should do with the surplus is such a massive question. And the idea that I can come in and start discussing that, and not just me, like anybody could come in and we can have a discussion about that. I would be laughed out of a room at KPMG, for example, whereas the co-op structure means that if I have a certain proposal, I can bring it into a meeting and it will get discussed by all the members, regardless of seniority or how long someone's been there or how much they know from an accounting point of view. That idea was so powerful and so different. Like in many ways, it took a while to get used to as well, right? Like it's not all sort of straightforward, because it means that you do have to communicate with each other a lot more. You do have to have difficult conversations with each other, because there is no boss that's going to tell you how to do it. You've got to decide amongst yourselves.
So in terms of recruitment, have you struggled to get experienced accountants to apply to third sector accountancy?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. I'm probably a good example of people struggling to get qualified accountants in. So like, I was a qualified accountant when I moved, but in terms of trying to recruit qualified people in, I think most of the people we've recruited at a qualified level are friends of friends. I would guess that there's a higher proportion of people going into accountancy that will lean towards, it being a really good way to make a ton of money. So you're probably less likely to find people who are willing to take a pay cut in accountancy than you are in certain other sectors, for example.
And then so the people that you are recruiting, majority are juniors, and you're then training them up.
Yeah, that's right, Caleb. So we usually recruit like a graduate trainee role. So they'd come and they'd work at TSA, but then they also do their accountancy exams over like a 3 to 4 year period. And then they'd be qualified and then they're good to go. The people who join us usually are here for the long run. So we have amazing retention at a qualified level. So we're hoping that will be the same at a trainee level as well.
Is there a worry within third sector accountancy that you maybe won't be able to replace those top roles?
Yeah, this is something we probably talk about most months that comes up. It's sort of like a rock and a hard place, isn't it? There's so many organizations that want support. We'd like to offer the support, but if you don't have enough qualified people to offer the support and support the trainees, you can't grow as an organization without sort of putting more and more burden on the few people who are qualified. I think that is a sort of concern, but it's something we're always thinking about. And I think at the moment it's really good. It seems like a really great bunch of people at the moment, people who are moving quite naturally, but it only takes one or two people to leave or one or two people to decide, I want to do something different. And it's a balancing act between having enough work for everyone to do, but then also having a bit of slack to, if somebody does leave, that you don't overwhelm yourself. And yeah, it does feel like a struggle at times to sort of manage capacity.
And then, coming back to this idea of growth, because you've said there is a demand for your services that kind of exceeds what you're able to do. And I know we've spoken a little bit about this before, that there's a slight resistance to wanting to get any bigger because there's a fear of diluting the values potentially. Could you talk a little bit more about that and which way third sector accountancy is kind of thinking of going on this?
Yeah, so probably that view of being wary of growth is more of a personal one than a co-op wide one, but there's been definitely a lot of talk about strategy and about, whether we want to grow, and if so, how fast. And I guess I can only speak from a personal perspective, but for me, there is a fear that you dilute the values of the co-op and you become just an accountancy firm, and which is fine, but and maybe some people want that to happen, but from a personal perspective, I'd really like to keep the values of, and keeping the cooperative principles front and center, and keeping the values of us being linked with the movement rather than just us sort of existing for ourselves. The resistance is also from a capacity point of view. If you grow, there's more people to train, there's more burden on maybe a disproportionate amount of individuals. And how do you deal with that? How do you maintain politics? I remember in the Asuma interview, he said that the 7 principles alongside the principles of the co-op values that Suma had sort of written themselves. That sounds ace. How do you maintain that culture of those things being part of the everyday? And I don't think we've got an answer yet. I think we're really new, which is exciting, but we're also tackling these questions on a daily basis and trying to figure out ways we can put things in place to make sure the culture stays. And then maybe growth is the answer that comes out of that, right? Once we've got a base.
We're coming to the end of the questions that I had. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Big up Punchcard.
Thanks to everybody listening. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, wherever you get your podcast. We're producing about one a month, so keep an eye out for the next episode.